Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I am your host, Courtney Anderson. This show is titled, How Do I Stop My Ex from Seeing Our Kids? And this show is part of our Law Lovers Lounge series. Our Law Lovers Lounge is a series of shows devoted to people who love the law. I'm one of those people. Obviously, you are too, because you're here listening, taking part in our program. The Law Lovers Lounge is a lounge because these are educational, general programs for the public to just sort of discuss and bring awareness to some general ideas. As a disclaimer, as always in this series, I must clearly, again, note that I am not your lawyer by the fact that you've listened to this program. I am an attorney. I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer unless you have signed a client contract with my law firm. This is a general program I put out to the world. As always, you can come to CourtneyAnderson.com, which is my website for questions, concerns, or issues about any of the other businesses I am involved in or services I provide. If you have a specific legal issue, my law firm website is litigationmitigation.com. So again, we're at the Law Lovers Lounge series, and we have a specific topic that is, how do I stop my ex from seeing our kids? Now, this topic was selected because it's one of the more common family law questions that I receive whenever I talk to people about family law, whenever I'm providing volunteer legal services to local communities where I live, and people come in with family law questions. Unfortunately, it's also the kind of question I get if I'm at some sort of social event and I'm not working, and people ask me, I heard, are you a lawyer? And then they want to ask me family law questions, which I can't answer, because I'm not their lawyer. I'm not even working. I'm just, like hanging out at a barbecue. So why is it such a common question? How do I stop my ex from seeing our kids? Why is it so common? Let's break down the question into some important parts. The first part of the question, if we look at the question in totality, right, and it says, how do I stop my ex from seeing our kids? If your ex legally has rights to the children, then the answer is you cannot stop them from seeing the kids. So I'm going to do this again. If your ex legally has rights to the children, and I'll go over that in a minute, what I mean, you cannot stop them from seeing the children. You cannot do it. So if you ask me how you can do it, and that they have legal rights, which I'm going to go over in a minute and explain what that means, you can't stop them. They have legal rights to see the children. Visit with the children. Spend time with the children. All right, so let's start going into the details of why this seems to be such a popular topic. Okay, so I said that if your ex has legal rights to the children, then you can't stop them. All right, what do I mean by legal rights to the children? Okay. Many of the time in many areas of law, but definitely in family law, there's a challenge because the things that the law describes and talks about and has rules about don't necessarily always match what it is that someone's telling me about in their real life, and they're not using terms that match up with what the law has set out as rules. So what do I mean? Okay, when somebody says X, so the question is, how do I stop my ex, right? The challenge is, X what? Your ex what? Because the answer to your ex what is going to answer whether or not they have legal rights to children, which will also help me be able to tell you that the answer is no, you can't stop them, or I can tell you, yes, you can stop them. But we need to start with getting an understanding of what is meant by the term X. And so here's what that's what I was saying, is that, many times people talk to me and they start talking, telling stories, trying to get me to be able to help them, and I want to help. Let's say I'm doing my volunteer work. I'm there. I am a lawyer. I'm at the courthouse, in my suit, working, doing my volunteer work. It is literally my job that I came down there at that time to do that thing, to sit there and talk to people about family law. So I'm here for just this purpose. Tell me what I can do to help. And so somebody will say something like, I need to stop my ex from seeing our kids. Okay, great. Your ex what? Your ex what? Your ex-husband, your ex-wife, your ex-boyfriend, your ex-girlfriend, your ex-common law husband, your ex-common law wife, your ex-partner, your ex-lover, your ex what? Okay. Now, some people would say, well, yeah, the question is, how do I stop my ex from seeing our kids? That should answer it. My ex, whatever. Our kids. All right, but here's the challenge again. What do you mean by our kids? The law has very specific rules about who has legal rights to the children. They also have really specific rules by what the law would call our kids. Those don't match many of the times in real life what somebody starts telling me they're doing in their real life. So when somebody says our kids, what do you mean our kids? Do you mean kids that you are the biological parent of and that the other person, your ex, is the biological parent of? And you know this? Do you mean that it's the children, the kids, are children that are your biological children and might be your ex-whatever's biological children? Okay. If you have conclusive evidence that you're the biological parent of the child and the other person is the biological parent of the child, and there has not been any other legal action to take away those biological rights, I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that, then the ex is a biological parent and you are a biological parent and you both have rights to see the children. And you cannot take away those rights. Here's what happens in real life. Somebody will say to me, these are our kids. But what they really mean is, it was a kid that I had that was my biological child, and then my ex, I met them or I lived with them or they were my ex-fiancé, and they treated the child like it was their child. They spent time with the child. They said, that's my son, that's my daughter. But that's not the biological parent. And this is where there's a whole industry, I have to just add, of pop culture and media built around literally the tests that they run to prove, biologically who is the biological parent, right? And there's talk shows, certainly in the U.S., I'm sure in many other parts of the world. In fact, the same shows that are in the U.S. I've seen in many other countries in the world, where literally the whole, talk show or chat show is accusations that somebody is the biological parent of a child, and then the show, I guess, pays for the test to test the DNA and see who is the biological parent, and then they unveil and they reveal on the chat TV show the results. So the host of the show literally will read out the results, and it'll say, Fred, you are not the father of Fred Jr. Okay. So here, let's try to see what's going on. Historically, it worked like this. And I'm speaking, of course, from the legal perspective in the U.S., although many countries are very similar, and some are totally different. You got to check where you live. But in general, it worked like this. Legal marriage is a big deal, and it's the foundation of so many rules and laws in society for a really long time. And it's a long-standing tradition in many, 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 many parts of the world. So legal marriage was the foundation. So the law said this. If two people are legally married, right, and a child is born, so, after the legal marriage, during the legal marriage, and that child is, the law assumes or presumes that those people are the legal parents. Most of this suspicion and concern is about the father. It's usually, obviously, easier historically to see who's a mother, right? Like who gave birth to the child. That's not the answer, though, anymore. Science and technology, which are wonderful, awesome things, have come up with ways where they can take the biological material from one woman, right, like the eggs, and they will harvest them. So women can actually go and sell, basically harvest their eggs, and someone else basically buys it. They use different terms sometimes because it sounds kind of crude to say you're selling it. But women can sell this genetic material, their eggs, and men can sell their genetic material, their sperm. And both men and women go to different businesses, and they sell their genetic material. The men sell their sperm. Sometimes they're generically called sperm banks, right? And the women sell their eggs, They don't call them egg banks, I don't think. But the sperm donations have gone on longer than the egg donations because the technology has improved to allow more of this. So it's much easier to sort of the mechanics of it for a male to donate his sperm than it is for a woman to donate her eggs because she literally has to have more of a medical procedure. She just on her own can't like reach in, pull out an egg, and donate it. She has to have basically medical procedure where trained professionals are able to medically go in and remove the eggs she's donating. Okay. And so science has come to a point now where both men and women can donate, all right, their material. And then other people can go and acquire or purchase. So I could go buy some sperm and buy eggs. I can take if I'm legally married, I could be legally married, and let's say that I'm legally married, I'm a female, I'm legally married, my husband is a male, and let's say that we go and we want to have children, and we go and we both buy egg from some other woman that donated it, and we buy sperm from some other man. And of course, you can go in these businesses, you read all about the people and their health history and all this because you want to make sure you're getting, the genes or everything, right? Like that's what I'm buying or investing in or whatever term you want to use. I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm just trying to move the conversation along. So, but I could be legally married, right? And then go out and acquire some other person's genetic egg and genetic sperm, and then you can have those combined together to create a viable a zygote embryo that then I can have implanted, if I'm able and willing to do so, it can be implanted into my body so that I can sort of just be the gestational host, but none of the genetic material belongs to myself or to my husband. We went out and acquired sperm, we went out and acquired egg, and then they can take those and combine them, medically in a lab, and then they have to implant them though, because after they combine them, then that part they can do, but they need to have somewhere for the zygote, hopefully fetus, to develop. And to the best of my knowledge, they can only do that in another woman. So when you do this, and science has this this happens every day, then DNA tests and asking who gave birth doesn't tell you who the genetic mother is, because I could give birth to a child and it's not my egg at all. There's no genetic relationship between myself and that child. I was just carrying it. And in fact, we have a whole nother, I'll just use the term business. Again, I'm not being offensive. I'm just trying to give somewhat clear labels. Let's say that my husband and I, we acquire egg and we acquire sperm, and then for whatever reason, I'm not going to use my body to be the gestational host. We can get another person called a surrogate, and then they go and they implant the genetic material into that person, and then that person just carries it until it's developed enough, until it's able to live, to be viable outside of the human body, and then it'll be born as a baby, right? That's a surrogate. And so surrogacy is incredibly common. You read about it all the time. Public figures and entertainers and professionals are share about it in the media. People are not at all anything but proud to share, we have our new child via surrogacy, and they shouldn't be anything but proud. This is a wonderful thing. Plus, there's a lot of finance involved in this. At least in the United States, this is all out of your pocket. The government doesn't pay for this. So, acquiring an egg, acquiring sperm, having those combined, having the potentially viable embryos implanted into the surrogate, all of this is incredibly, emotionally difficult and financially challenging. So people who do it, most we can assume, if not all, are truly just want to have, a family, and this is the way that's best for them. And it's a wonderful thing, of course, for someone to want to have a family. But my point is simply this: a question that historically would be really easy, who's the mom, isn't. Because who is the mom? It's not the surrogate. Almost always the surrogate, when that's not the person who's going to keep the child. That's why they're called the surrogate, right? Like, you're just standing in. You're the surrogate for somebody. We just need somebody to carry the material until it's viable, because human development is it's a relatively, well, I don't know. I was going to say relative to some other species. Well, to some other species, it's a relatively long sort of period of development before the child could be viable to live outside of a human. So the surrogate usually doesn't have legal rights. That's part of why there's a contract and there's payment and all this, and it's defined, right? And it's more common, I believe, today that you're not getting the egg and that same female is also the surrogate. It would seem like that, that would be a potential setup for maybe someone to feel some sort of psychological or emotional bond if it was their genetic materials. I think it's more understandably simple for a female to feel like, oh, well, I went and they implanted, the embryo was not my genetic material at all, and then my job was to carry it to term, which I did, and now it's a healthy, viable baby, and now the parents have it, and it's wonderful. But there's so many players in this, right? So who's the mom? You do a DNA test on a chat show, and who's the mom? The DNA test will just tell you who the genetic material is. But is the egg donor the mom? Well, these things are all being in court around the world. I'm sure we're going to see a ton of more legal questions about all of this. But it used to be simple historically. People were married in a legal marriage. The government would assume that all of the children are their genetic children. With men, it used to be more of a concern because it's easier for one man to go out and impregnate, donate his sperm, through intimate relations, than it is for a woman to go out and donate her eggs. We just talked about that earlier, right? So it used to be very simple that we would assume the woman must be her baby, right? She carried it, or that's what we were told, and then we must assume it's his because he's the legal husband. The presumption that the legal spouse is the parent still stands in many parts of the world. So where I practice law, if you're legally married to somebody, the presumption the law is going to make, the government's going to make, is that's the father, or that's the mother. Now, of course, in this very recent history, all these other types of options have come up. So just because somebody's legally my husband does not mean that his genetic material is what was used for the child. It could be that we went to a sperm bank and we used somebody else's genetic material. So you go do DNA testing, it's not going to do you do any good, because that's not I know my husband's not the father. In terms of genetically, because we went out and purchased sperm from somebody else's sperm bank. In other instances, people are dishonest, and maybe they were they were cheating or having an affair. So this is where it gets really messy. So my husband thought it was his genetic material that I gave birth to, our child, but then really secretly I know it isn't, because I went out and had an affair with somebody else that I wanted to have. And so it's that person's genetic material, or it might be. So what you tend to see now is it's so difficult to understand. What do you mean by our kids? So the law still thinks if you're legally married to somebody, now legal marriage, the rules are, again, changing, but ideally you can't be married to more than one person at a time in most parts of the world, or many parts or some parts. In the U.S., legally, if you're legally married to one person, you have to divorce them, and then you can legally marry another person. But you just can't be legally married to one person and just keep adding other marriages. Now, the challenge is that it's a big country and all the government records there's not like a list that when you go to apply for a marriage license, to the best of my knowledge, where the local government clerk says, oh, well, let me look and see if you're already married to somebody else. They don't do that. So there are people, I've had people that came to my law office who start telling me a story, and they start telling me, oh, this person, my ex wants to see my kids, and I'm like, okay, is that your legal husband? Oh yeah, my legal husband. And then they start talking, and then it turns out that they did go down to the courthouse and have a legal marriage with this person, but they also had one a few years before that with another person that they're still married to that they never got a divorce from. So that means the second marriage is void. It doesn't really exist, and because of that, it impacts whether or not the person can see your kids. Do you understand? Okay. The person who is has legal rights to children can and will see the children, and you can't stop them. And in fact, I mentioned this even though it's a whole separate topic, but it's usually tied to this. Even if somebody legally is holding rights to the child, so they're either the genetic parent or they were in a legal marriage, or they held themselves out. And what that means is they went out and told the world, this is my child. I love this child. It's my child. In some parts of the world, then you can go to court and say that because they held themselves out to be, and there is nobody else, right? So if there was nobody that was legally married to the other parent, and there's been no DNA testing, and this person held themselves out, then okay, then they can be legally recognized as the parent. So if they're legally the parent, and then you split up or whatever, the relationship doesn't continue, and then you get child support orders. Child support's where you go to the government and say, look, this is a person who legally has rights to the child. I want them, though, to pay for support to the child, which is totally logical, right? Since they're the one that has the legal rights to the child, they have to also have the right responsibility, right? Rights and responsibilities go together. So then the government doesn't give you child support. All the government does is write on a piece of paper a judgment, and they tell you, okay, well, how much money does that other person have, and they take a percentage of that. This is a rough scale. So in Texas, it started I think it started 20% one child, 25% two children. It just goes up and up and up till it's 50%, where it maxes out. Of what? Of the money they make. Support is money I need from that person to help support the child, right? The money comes from the person. It doesn't come from the government. All the government does is write down a judgment and tell you how much it is. And then because people don't always get along, the government has set up all these elaborate systems to try to, get the money from somebody. Like the government will pull it out of somebody's paycheck and then give it to the other person, right? Because the people can't, communicate amongst themselves to do it. But if somebody has legal rights to the children, you cannot stop them from seeing the children. That's what I said at the beginning of the show. The challenge is, in real life, people say things that they're not as legally specific as they need to be. So when I said, what do you mean by our kids, what do you mean by that? If you were legally married to the person when the child was born, then those people are the presumed parents, right? Now, sometimes I said people agree honestly amongst themselves, oh, we're not going to use my genetic material, your sperm or egg, we're going to go get that from somewhere else, and then we'll use that. That's okay. But then the people know whose genetic material is used. The bigger challenge is when people aren't honest, and people lie, and then they don't tell the person. So they're legally married to somebody, that person's like, oh, this is my child, they think it's their genetic child, and then it turns out that their ex, either ex-girlfriend, we were doing legal marriage, ex-wife, was dishonest and went and got somebody else's sperm, and without asking or sharing anything, just was having a romantic or emotional, they were cheating on their spouse. And then when they do the DNA test, it turns out that's not your DNA material. And then that person, even though they're legally married, can go to court and say, look, hey, that's somebody else's legal material, and this test shows it's this other person. It's Jim. It's not me at all. Jim needs to be the one to pay child support. So as time has gone by, the really simple old rule was your legal marriage, then that's your child, right? But now we went through this whole thing about technology. Just because I'm legally married, and even if I gave birth, like physically carried, was the gestational host, and then the child, literally was born from my body, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's my genetic child. You can run the test, and it turns out that's not my egg. And I guarantee you, just like we had dishonesty where a male would find out, that's not my sperm, I guarantee you there's cases where the man thought, oh, that's her child. But no, she went out and got some other egg and didn't tell him. For who knows what reasons. There's so many complications to this. The answer is easy. If they have legal rights to the children, you cannot stop them from seeing the children. What if they haven't paid their child support? That's actually a separate show, but I'm going to answer it because I've mentioned it and I have to. It's irrelevant. Meaning, I don't care how behind they are on their child support. Meaning they haven't made their payments. They still have the legal right to see their children. Done. I finished it. I answered it. Going backwards from that, though, are those their children? And you'd be surprised. I talked to somebody a few months ago about one of these cases, and usually the children are younger when people start talking about this stuff, the money and who gets to visit and all this. But this was somebody, and the child was like 30 years old. But there was a problem because there'd been an old child support order from when the child was, under 18. And it was a man who was speaking to me, and he'd never paid it. And so it was from another state. He'd moved to a different place. And so finally the government caught up and recognized it was him, the same person, and he owed this other money. And so they started to try to take this old child support money out of his current income, right? And then he's mad. Now he's upset, right? And so then he's sitting there telling me that this isn't even his child, right? So these things don't just go away. If the decision is made to acquire the genetic material and combine it in the method and then create a viable embryo and then implant the embryo somewhere through its gestational development so that it's a viable, independent human, then that's a lot of steps. But if that's done, then there's all these questions that have to be answered, and they don't go away until, I guess, everybody's dead and everything's been distributed with inheritance. So how do you stop your ex from seeing your kids? If the ex has legal rights to the children, you cannot stop them. They have legal rights that are separate from whether or not they were dating you or married to you or living with you or any of that kind of garbage. That's two separate things. Having legal rights to the child is a relationship between that person who has the legal right, whether it's they're the genetic parent or they were legally married and agree that they'll be, the parent, and there's nobody else listed as the parent. But once that is established, then then they are entitled to visits and custody with their children, period. Now, in some instances, a parent can engage in other legal behavior that violates laws that can put their relationship with their children at risk. In other words, if the person abuses and is found by a court to have engaged in, such what they call malfeasance, so many bad things, abuse, neglect, all this kind of stuff to the child, the government can, in the places where I am a lawyer, can move to terminate the parental relationship. It's called a TPR, termination of parental relationship, termination of parental rights. And that severs, I've been saying since the whole show began, I said if the person has legal rights to the child, you can't stop them from seeing them. I don't care if they're late on child support, I don't care if you hate them, I don't care, whatever. Because that's a separate relationship that just goes on, forever. And in some instances, they can terminate that relationship. They can cut the tie, right, between the parent and the child. Those cases are sad, but they happen constantly. Now, if that happens, then there's another legal ruling that says you're not the parent. You were the parent in the past, but because the government proved that you had done these things that terminated the parental rights, now that you're not the legal parent anymore, and now that child doesn't have that legal parent or both legal parents, and now the child can then be adopted by some other people who come along. But you can't adopt a child who still has legal parents unless the legal parents, of course, agree to it. Do you see the difference? It's like I said before, legally married, you're legally married to one person. I don't care if you keep going to courthouses and keep having new marriage ceremonies. None of those are valid. They're all void because you're only going to have one. So when you added one spouse, you have to take that away by divorce, right, or annulment. And then you can add another person can be your one spouse, but you can't keep one spouse and then keep adding other extra ceremonies on top of it and claim those are spouses. They're not legally recognized. This is a big deal. This happens all the time. I also have to mention in some parts of the U.S. and the world, there's this idea of common law marriage, which is where you never went to the government at all and even even did this marriage license or any of that. You just started calling each other spouse, husband and wife, or whatever. And in many states, those are legally valid marriages. To get out of them, you got to go get divorced or annul an annulment just like you normally would. And that's where I saw a lot of this. Somebody has one common law spouse, and then they feel like, oh, we never went to a court or whatever to get, married. We just said we were. So when they, quote, break up, they just say to each other, I don't want to be with you anymore, and they leave. But then they don't understand that when you legally married them, and the test is that you agreed to be married, you held yourself out as married, meaning you showed to the world, told other people, and then you cohabitated. If you do those things, then to break that, you're going to have to get legally divorced. You don't have to say to each other, we're divorced. You have to go through the whole court thing because you got married legally, which is another complication. I mean, a lot of people who have multiple common law situations. Again, only one is valid. The oldest one, the first one, that's the only one that's valid. So when you say, how do I stop my ex from seeing my kids, our kids, if they are our children that your ex has a legal relationship with, then you can't do anything. And they have the right to see their children unless and until the rights are terminated. Now, what you see in a lot of child custody fights is each person usually accuses the other person of doing horrible, bad things to the children in the hopes, I think, of stopping visitation and custody and all this. It's part of the reason I don't go practice trials and family law anymore, because it's incredibly depressing. Obviously, if you lie under oath, that's a crime. But until there's such a finding by the courts that the person is doing a horrible thing, you're not going to stop them from seeing the child. Now, can people have supervised visitation? Yes. That means that there's someone to supervise to make sure that the adult's not abusing the child, of course. But they're still going to get visitation. I don't care if they're in jail. That happens all the time. Someone's going to take them over there and they're going to see their parent. So there's a lot of questions that we asked. The answers are going to depend on your real life situation. If it's the person who legally has rights to the children, you cannot stop them from seeing them. If it's not someone who has legal rights, it was somebody you were dating, it was somebody that was your boyfriend or girlfriend, it was somebody that you lived with but you already had a legal marriage with somebody else. If it was any of this kind of stuff, they don't have any legal rights. Understand? So they don't have any legal rights. How do you stop them from seeing them? You just say no. And don't let them see them. Because they don't have any rights to see them. They're not legally the parent. They were just somebody in your life. Now they're gone. So, as I said in the show, this is all really interesting. The technology and the changes and everything, egg donors and sperm donors and surrogacy and all, it's endlessly interesting, but it makes it incredibly complicated. I will also add that in many parts of the world now, although this doesn't actually impact really what we were talking about, but you can have two people in a legal marriage and they're the same gender. But it's still going to, that's really not factually that relevant because it's the same situation. You know, who's the genetic parent? And is there a gestational or surrogate parent? Was there a legal marriage? I mean, it's the same questions. But as long as you continue to separate the genetics from the legal relationship, it adds all these layers of trying to figure out who is the mom, who is the dad. I don't know. It's interesting, and it really is. And I'm sure science is going to do even more interesting things, so there's probably going to be more layers to this to come. But my final closing part would be this. Think very carefully, please, about the decision to bring children into the world. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity and noble thing to do so. But you need to think and make decisions, and I would strongly suggest that you try the honesty. Whose genetic material was used? Okay? But understand that when a legal relationship is established between a person and the child, that's separate from you. So you can't stop them from seeing them if they have a legal right to do so. If they don't have a legal right to do so, they were just your boyfriend or your friend or your girlfriend or whatever, then you just say no. They don't have any right. And they can't do anything about it if they can't go to court and prove that they have some sort of, legal right to the children. So, fascinating area. Very interesting. Again, you can always come to CourtneyAnderson.com for information. And if you have specific legal issues, my law firm site is litigationmitigation.com. And as always, I appreciate your time. Thank you.